The mid-afternoon heat pressed down on the forward operating base, turning the air above the motor pool into a wavering curtain. Beyond the chain-link perimeter, the land stretched flat and empty, bleached by the sun until even the shadows seemed thin. Inside the mess hall, the air was only marginally cooler, the tang of disinfectant mixed with the heavier scent of reheated stew and fresh bread. The steady clang of trays against the serving line blended with bursts of conversation, boots scuffing against the floor, and the occasional bark of laughter from a corner table. Elena Carter moved through it all without hesitation. Weaving between the steam table and the stock bins at the back wall, her grease-stained apron bore the marks of the day's work, but her sleeves were neatly folded just below the elbow, not a crease out of place. She carried a large pot to the serving station, balanced easily despite its weight, and set it down with a controlled movement that kept the surface of the soup from rippling. A young corporal waiting in line glanced at her and smirked to the soldier beside him. "Just the cook," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Bet she's never seen the other side of the wire." The other soldier laughed, shaking his head, and the conversation moved on. Elena didn't react. She ladled stew into the next tray with the same measured pace she had for the last hour, her eyes steady on the task. Outside the mess hall windows, a thin wall of dust moved lazily along the horizon, the kind of faint disturbance most people would overlook between servings. She paused with a ladle in one hand and looked out toward it. Hekeselinger, not searching so much as measuring, her focus narrowing as if noting details only she could read. A shout from further down the line drew her back, and she resumed filling trays without comment. The line thinned as the midday rush passed. A stack of clean trays clattered into place near the entrance. Elena stepped into the storage room, retrieved a sack of onions, and began peeling them at the prep table. Her knife worked with small, precise motions, each cut uniform. The same care went into arranging the chopped pieces into a clean bin, the edges aligned like a diagram. Through the open door, the base carried on in its steady rhythm, an engine revving near the motor pool, a radio crackling somewhere close, a burst of boots hitting the ground in formation. The air shimmered in the distance, heat distorting the straight lines of the supply road that led away from the base. She tied off the onion bag, set it aside, and wiped her hands on the apron. For a brief moment, her eyes drifted once more toward that distant shimmer. The mess hall noise faded in her mind, and her shoulders settled into the stillness of someone who had been here before, in another place, under another name. Then the door swung open, and she reached for the next tray. The news came in on a burst of static, cutting through the usual hum of the base. A young private stepped into the mess hall with a radio pressed to his ear, murmuring into it as he crossed toward the operations tent. Outside, the sound of hurried footsteps on gravel broke the afternoon rhythm. Elena Carter was carrying a tray of clean mugs from the drying rack when she heard the phrase that pulled her attention. Main supply convoy halted. Bridge down. Enemy strike confirmed. By the time she stepped out into the heat, the command staff was already moving into the ops tent. The heavy canvas flap swung open and closed, releasing a faint smell of hot electronics and dust each time someone entered. She balanced a cardboard tray of steaming coffee cups in her hands and walked toward the tent. Inside, the light was dim and tinted green from the canvas overhead. A large folding table dominated the space, covered in maps weighed down by radios, pens, and half-empty mugs. A base map lay open at the center, route markers in red and blue tracing supply lines across the region. The officers stood in a loose half-circle, shoulders tense. Voice clipped. One man pointed at a stretch of road on the map, tapping it with the back of a pen as he spoke about repair timelines. Another shook his head, muttering about enemy movement to the east. The radio operator kept adjusting the headset at his temple, jotting notes without lifting his eyes. Elena stepped in quietly and set the coffee down within reach. She didn't leave right away. Her gaze drifted to the map, to the destroyed bridge's location, and then to the faint contour lines marking the hills to the west. She recognized the pattern. Instantly rugged terrain? Yes, but passable with the right sequence of turns and careful fuel management. You could run them through here, she said softly, pointing at the alternate path. Her tone was even calm, and without embellishment. A few heads turned toward her. She explained, if they cut west, follow the ridge for about 10 kilometers, then drop south along the riverbank. They can bypass the bridge and come out near the fuel depot without crossing open ground. A major standing closest to her raised an eyebrow. That's not kitchen talk. Ma'am. He gave a faint smile as if to soften the sting, but his eyes had already returned to the map. Appreciate the coffee. She nodded once and stepped back, letting the tent flap fall closed behind her. Outside, the sunlight was blinding after the dim interior. Across the motor pool, a thin plume of dust curled upward from the road leading east, the same road the convoy had been on when the strike hit. The sound of the radios carried faintly from inside, muffled by the tent walls. Elena walked back toward the mess hall, her face unreadable. The coffee cups were gone from her tray, replaced by the weight of an idea left sitting in a room where it would almost certainly be ignored. The air shimmered in the distance, and for a moment she let her eyes rest on that horizon, the way she once did in a different uniform, calculating the safest way through. Then she pushed the mess hall door open and stepped back inside. By mid-afternoon, the mess hall had settled into its slower rhythm. The chatter of the lunch rush had faded, replaced by the clink of utensils being sorted, and the low hum of the cooler in the corner. The air carried a mix of smells, roasted vegetables cooling in trays, detergent from the sink, and a faint tang of ink from the map spread out on the center table. Between a stack of clean trays and a crate of canned peaches, Elena Carter had cleared a working space. She unrolled a laminated regional map, its surface still creased from storage, and weighed down the edges with metal serving spoons. She worked with deliberate precision, the pencil in her hand sharpened to a fine point. Her marks were small but exact waypoints drawn in neat circles, contour lines traced for emphasis, choke points flagged in red, refuel spots marked with simple X's. She paused every so often to study the terrain, her gaze following the lines as if tracing a memory. In her mind, the map shifted. The colors faded to the dusty browns of Iraq, and the printed symbols gave way to the sounds of engines rumbling in staggered formation. She could hear the muted crack of distant artillery, feel the low vibration of tires on uneven road, and smell diesel heavy in the air. The rhythm of the old convoys settled in her chest, steady and familiar. The tent flap across the yard snapped open and closed with the wind, carrying faint bursts of radio chatter. Words drifted in contact, reports, grid coordinates. The sharp tone of urgency. She rolled her shoulders back and lifted the map, heading toward the open air before it could sag under the weight of her thoughts. Outside, the sun hit hard, and the glare bounced off the dust in the yard. She walked to where the convoy liaison was checking over a list on a clipboard. His brow furrowed. She waited until he finished speaking with a sergeant, then held out the map. I think I can get them around the bridge, she said, her tone calm. She unfolded the map on the hood of a parked truck and pointed to the westward route she had marked. If they push through here, skirt the ridge, and cut down along the river, they can make it without crossing open ground. It's tighter driving, but safer than sitting out there. He leaned in, scanning the notes, the shorthand symbols she had used for hazards and timing. His eyes flicked to hers for a moment, registering something he didn't name. Then he straightened, folding the map carefully before handing it back. It's solid thinking, he said, voice even. But I can't run this upstairs without a scout report. Right now it's untested intel. She nodded, tucking the map under her arm without letting disappointment show. Understood. Back in the mess hall, she laid the map down again and went back to her pencil, adding a second set of timing notes in case anyone needed them later. From somewhere outside came the staccato bursts of more radio traffic. Closer now. The words were clipped. Urgent enemy vehicles sighted east of the convoy's position. She paused, the pencil tip resting on the laminated surface, and looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the heat haze shimmered over the supply road, and a thin trail of dust curled upward like a signal. Her shoulders squared. She returned to marking the map, her stroke steady, knowing the paper in front of her was no longer just a suggestion. It was the path they would take when every other option failed, and she would be ready when that moment came. The decision came just after midday, announced not with a meeting but in a series of short, clipped orders relayed across the yard. The engineers had given their verdict the bridge was a total loss. For now, repair estimates stretched into days. The weather officer followed with his own bad news. High winds in the upper levels would make airdrops unstable, turning them into a gamble with both supplies and lives. In the absence of anything better, the alternate route Elena Carter had laid out was no longer just an idea. It was the only viable path. Still, acceptance came with caution. Command ordered an armed scout team to ride ahead, clearing the first segments of the road and watching for movement. The plan's adoption was quiet, almost reluctant, as if saying it too loudly might give it more credit than they were comfortable with. The motor pool roared to life, the air filled with the heavy clatter of tools and the deep, rhythmic hiss of compressed air guns, locking bolts into place. Soldiers worked in teams, checking tire pressure, loading fuel drums, and securing tarps over crates. The smell of diesel exhaust hung low in the heat, mingling with the faint metallic tang of hot engine blocks. Elena stood near the shade of a cargo truck's wheel well, a handheld GPS in one hand and a folded clipboard under her arm. The screen glowed pale green as she tapped in coordinates, her fingers moving without hesitation. Each waypoint received a brief label in shorthand marks for narrow passes, unstable shoulders, and potential blind corners. The kind of notations that didn't just suggest obstacles, but anticipated them in the sequence they'd be encountered. A sergeant passing with a crate of spare parts slowed for a moment, eyes catching the screen. He looked at the symbols and numbers, the way she grouped them into clusters that mirrored convoy sequencing from standard military briefs. His gaze shifted to her face, as if a half-formed memory was stirring. But he said nothing. With a small nod, he moved on. Across the yard, the scout team was methodical in its own preparations. Rifles were checked, optics adjusted, sling straps tightened. One soldier laid out a compact drone for quick reconnaissance, its rotors gleaming under the hard light. Another ran a quick radio check, the static popping before voices confirmed the link. Elena finished the last input on the GPS and powered it down. She handed it to a corporal who accepted it with a faintly puzzled expression, perhaps surprised by the confidence in her tone as she said, "These are in order. Don't skip any. Even if the stretch looks clear." He nodded automatically, already turning toward the lead vehicle. The rest of the convoy crews moved with that particular energy that comes before an untested run, steady hands, masking the awareness of what might go wrong. Ratchets clicked in quick bursts. A mechanic leaned into an engine bay, muttering about a loose belt. A driver strapped down his gear, checked it twice, and tapped the dashboard before climbing in. From the far side of the yard, a faint plume of dust was visible against the horizon. Curling upward like the first line drawn on a map, sunlight flashed off the metal edges of side mirrors, gun mounts, and fuel canisters, scattering brief glints across the vehicles. Elena caught herself watching it for longer than she intended before stepping back toward the mess hall. No one called her back or asked her to ride along. They had what they needed from her. Now her route, her timing, her careful anticipation of the terrain. Whether they understood how she knew these things didn't matter. The road would prove it soon enough, and she would be ready to hear how it ended. Engines turned over one by one until the convoy rumbled like a low storm. The lead truck eased forward. Then the next, each vehicle settling into the slow pull heavy loads, gravel popped under tires and metal straps rattled against fuel drums. Windows stayed cracked for air, thick with dust and diesel. Beyond the wire, the road narrowed to a pale ribbon through dry gullies. The land pitching upward in patient steps. Bass noise fell away until only engines, radios, and wind remained. Elena Carter rode in the last supply truck. Knees braced, headset snug against her ears. The cable coiled at her collar like memory turned into wire. The GPS above the glove box blinked green waypoints she had set hours earlier in the motor pool's shade. She watched them tick past. Named in her shorthand cutline rise. Loose shelf. River lip. Blind saddle. She breathed with the engine. In on the climb. Out on the descent. Voice steady for the net as the land began to test the line. Lead. This is tail. Hold 30 and drift right. 2 meters at the next crest. Crosswind will shove the nose. The reply came back tight and quick. Copy drift. Right 2. The gullies deepened, and the earth took on that broken look that swallows sound. Dust slid in slow sheets and turned trucks ghost pale, before clearing to reveal antennae and gun shields flashing in sun. Gears strained. A metallic groan under the thrum of tires. Casual talk died. Calls clipped to single words. Clear. Hold. Rolling. The first waypoint clicked over. The second arrived faster than the map suggested. Elena angled to see past mirror flare and felt wind press the truck. She pictured the ridge in plan view, the bend pinched by erosion, the outside edge thin as tin. Lead. Ease one, she said. Next turn narrows. Put left tires just inside the crown and feather brake. Everyone mirror spacing. No accordion. Brake lights winked like stitched red thread. The convoy took the turn with the slow authority of endurance. They hit the first challenge where the road climbed in a losing argument with the slope. Loose shale coated the incline like marbles poured down a board. The fuel truck slotted third, began to fishtail. Weight sloshing. Rear axle, tossing a hand's width. Then another. Elena closed her eyes for a breath and pulled a file from memory. Iraq at night. Headlights, tunneling dust. A wrecker sliding on a grade that never should have held vehicles. Run the shoulder where roots knit the soil. Tires bite. Line steadies. She opened her eyes. 3. Shift right and ride the seam where scrub holds. Keep speed even and let the tank settle. Lead. Hold at the top and block at an angle. Nobody passes until 3 is clear. Acknowledgement clicked. The fuel truck drifted right, wobbled once, then caught. A quick cheer rose and died. The rest came up with patient discipline. Engines growling low. Brakes eased to keep momentum alive. Dust hung above the ridge in veils. The second challenge waited ahead. A narrow switchback cut into the slope. The approach lied, and a rock outcrop hid the true angle until they were inside it. Visibility collapsed into grit. The GPS ticked to blind hook, and the truck's suspension flexed. Stop short of the marker, Elena said. We will back the lead through the angle. Tail will talk you. Everyone hold and check brake temps. She stepped into air tasting of rust and sun and walked the outside edge counting paces. Scanning for crumble. The lead driver's face was a pale oval behind glass. Jaw tight. Elena lifted her palm and moved it in small arcs. The motion mirrored by the wheel as he inched backward. Tires squealed. A rear corner kissed rock and left a chalk smear. Half turn right. Hold. Fraction left. Roll 2 feet. Stop. One by one, the trucks pulled the maneuver. Mirrors tucked. Spotters using glove taps and shorthand signals learned in motor pools. She staged them in a pocket beyond to cool brakes and breathe. Jokes, died unsaid. Drivers watched her when she spoke. She nodded once, accepting the change without feeding it, then climbed back in and closed the door on the heat. The third challenge lay where the road pretended to be whole, but was only a crust stretched over a ravine. On the map it read level. A trick of contour. From the cab, it looked like a straight shot across pale soil. The GPS blinked its warning anyway. Her shorthand read skin over bone. Lead. Slow to 10. 2 and 3. Prepare to redistribute. Pull weight off the left when your front axle crosses center. Pass it down. Belts clicked. Orders moved vehicle to vehicle. Men shifted forward to change balance. The lead eased onto the crust, and the earth sagged a breath. The truck kept moving. A crack opened where the last rainy season had carved a channel, and dust had healed it like a scar. The second truck reached the seam, and everything held because weight had been pulled just enough to keep the skin from tearing. The rest crossed in silence, broken only by faint stones scraping sidewalls. They descended toward the river lip, and the dust changed character. Instead of floating, it traced quick eddies and drew short tails behind each tire. Sun burned flat against the slope and turned silhouettes hard and thin. The net crackled with contact reports far east, close enough to remind them the world had teeth. Next turn in 100 meters. Elena said, "You will feel the grade shift. Stay off full brake. Pulse and let the gear bite. Hold spacing." Respect answered in the way no one stepped on her channel. They threaded between boulders, set like careless cairns. Engine vibrations climbed through seat frames into spines, until they matched the heartbeat and then replaced it. Soldiers tightened harnesses. Bottles clinked. Hands found better grips. The river showed as a narrow ribbon between stones and thorn. They followed it downstream on a terrace, barely 3 vehicles wide. The drop hidden by brush that betrayed itself only with the rush of current. A small slide sloughed from the upper bank and dusted the hood of the 5th truck. "Hold 2 lengths," she said. "If the wall wants to come down, give it room." The slide trickled to a stop, and the road held. Between calls, a sliver of dawn in Iraq returned. A convoy stepping from a dirt strip. While the air tasted of copper and exhaust, a young lieutenant had asked how she kept it straight. "You listen to the ground before you listen to the radio," she said, and meant every word. Waypoints fell behind them, and the GPS beeped small approvals. The line tightened at the blind saddle. A gust funneled through the notch and tried to lift the rear of the cargo truck 4th in line. Staggered crawl. Elena called. Trucks moving like chess pieces, exchanging squares. The gust spent itself and quiet returned with the frankness of heat. She reminded drivers to look past the bumper ahead and read terrain for themselves. Their voices changed when they did, lighter with attention and less with fear. They climbed a low ridge, crested, and saw flats that would carry them if the last stretch held. Dust trailed in bands, enough to announce their presence, and yet nothing moved on the horizon. No one asked how far. 6 kilometers to the service road. She told them, "Fuel check at the gate marker. Stay in line. Do not get greedy." Her calm slid through the net like poured water. She kept pace slow where impatience would break axles, and pressed it where hesitation would sink wheels. The service road appeared as cracked asphalt thrown across scrub like a lifeline. The lead rolled front tires onto it and stopped as ordered. Engines idled hot. Men leaned back for a second. They had not earned yet. Elena flexed her hands and felt the blocks pulse through the floor. A steady vibration that had carried them across ground that could have taken any one of them. "Tail to lead," she said. "Convoy intact. Mark this route as viable." She removed the headset and the world widened again. Insects scraped ditch grass. Metal pinged as it cooled. Wind lifted and dropped dust like a veil that would soon close. In the mirror, she saw drivers looking forward, not back. The GPS blinked its final waypoint and went quiet. Green light steady as breath. Real leadership worked in the space between engines and dust. A voice that asked for nothing and gave them the line through. Respect showed up as silence on the net and unhurried hands on brakes. the convoy steady and ready for the next call. Elena had just marked the next GPS tick when the radio crackled with a clipped intercept from the scout net. The translation came through in pieces, but the meaning was unmistakable. 2 enemy elements were moving toward the end of their alternate route. She leaned closer to the headset, filtering out the engine noise, and asked for distance. The reply was tense, close enough to be trouble if they hesitated. The last 2 miles of track were bare rock and hardpan, with no cover except for a series of low, uneven berms. The terrain maps barely showed. She studied the ground ahead through the dust haze. Heat shimmer made the far ridge look like it was breathing. In that distortion, she pictured the exposed stretch the convoy was about to hit, and she didn't wait for permission. Her voice came through calm and level, instructing the lead driver to break formation into staggered sprints. Half the trucks would hold behind each berm while the other half lunged forward, leapfrogging until they reached the far slope. The drivers hesitated. It wasn't in the brief, and it wasn't a maneuver. Most of them had practiced on supply hauls. She repeated the order, giving exact second counts for each push. Her tone was steady enough that they moved before they realized they'd committed. The first pair of trucks surged, gears straining under the load, dust plumes blooming behind them. The others crouched low in their cabs, eyes scanning the horizon. Rifles balanced across steering columns or gripped tight in door mounts. Visibility dropped fast. The dust hung in the air, swallowing shapes until only the lead vehicle's antenna showed above the brown curtain. Elena called the timing again, adjusting intervals by ear as wind gusts shifted the cloud. Engines revved in unison for each sprint, the vibration through the frames sinking like a heartbeat. The whole line shared. Between bursts, there was a hollow, quiet, the kind that made every driver's eyes dart to the skyline. She kept her own gaze on the GPS and the terrain, counting down to each launch with precision learned years ago in convoys that didn't have the luxury of open lanes. Back then, she'd called timing for armored Humvees under fire, using defiles and culverts as shields. The logic was the same here. Movement in bursts. Cover when you could, and never let the column become a single exposed target. Halfway through the stretch, a gust split the dust enough for her to see the lead trucks breaking into the clear. She shortened the next count by 2 seconds, pushing the final group forward sooner to close the gap. The last truck's tires kicked loose rock into the haze, but the driver kept his line straight, following her voice more than his own sight. The berms fell behind. The ground leveled into the approach to the exit ridge. No contact. No flashes of muzzle or glass. Still, no one relaxed. The discipline held until the entire column was behind the ridgeline. Only then did the engines ease off, the radios filling with short acknowledgments and low exhalations. Elena let the headset hang loose around her neck. Ahead, the convoy's dust trail began to thin, the plume breaking apart into stray wisps that dissolved in the afternoon light. Behind them, the exposed stretch shimmered in the heat haze, empty now, except for their fading tracks. A sergeant in the middle trucks keyed his mic and said, almost offhand, that the timing had been dead on. She answered with a simple copy. No one said her name. No one mentioned the fact that she had adjusted the plan without clearance. The natural berms were already fading into memory. Just another piece of landscape. But she knew they had been the difference. The improvised cover that turned a clear killing ground into a corridor they could cross. Relief came in small doses. The radio settled into routine check-ins. The drivers shifted their grips, the white knuckles easing as speed normalized. The hum of engines lost its edge and returned to the background. Elena studied the GPS one more time, ticking off the waypoint for the exit, then folded it back into its pouch. They were through. The mission wasn't done, but the stretch that could have ended it had passed without a shot fired. She looked once more at the open ground behind them, watching the last of the dust dissolve, and then turned her focus forward. Adaptation had carried them where the plan might not have. The convoy rolled slowly toward the base perimeter, each truck coated in a layer of dust and grit that caught the late afternoon light in muted streaks. The engines hissed and idled, still hot from the strain of the rough terrain. Carrying the faint scent of diesel into the air, soldiers leaned from their cabs, scanning the horizon and each other, expressions shifting from tense focus to exhaustion, relief, and a quiet, dawning respect. The radio clicks had faded to silence, replaced by the steady thrum of idling motors and the soft scrape of tires over gravel. Elena Carter stepped down from the last truck, her movements measured and unhurried. She wiped her hands on the edge of her grease-stained sleeves, then adjusted her cap against the sun. She walked past the vehicles lined up like pieces of a completed puzzle, each one telling a story of careful navigation and precise timing. No one cheered. Instead, soldiers exchanged glances and subtle nods, a silent acknowledgement of what had just been accomplished. A mechanic, crouched near a wheel well, straightened and muttered under his breath. "She's done this before." His words weren't loud, but they carried weight for anyone listening closely. Elena allowed a faint nod in response. Nothing more, letting the quiet recognition exist without comment. The dust settled slowly around the convoy, filling the gaps between vehicles and coating the footprints left behind. For a moment, everything seemed still, the tension of the mission dissolving into the hum of engines cooling in the late light. Elena's eyes swept over the assembled trucks, then the surrounding terrain, scanning as she always did, assessing the aftermath. The convoy was intact, the risk navigated, and the path forward clear. Respect didn't need fanfare. It was present in the shared silence, the nods, the unspoken understanding that one woman had guided them safely through what could have been disaster. The mission had ended. Yet the work, the vigilance, and the quiet authority that had carried it would continue without ceremony. Just as she preferred, the mess hall smelled faintly of cooked vegetables and warm bread, the scent replacing the lingering tang of diesel and dust that had clung to the base all day. Evening light poured through the wide windows, casting long shadows across tables and benches where soldiers ate quietly, unaware of the day's full story. Elena Carter moved between the trays with practiced efficiency, her hands steady as she served portions. The grease-stained apron tied neatly at her waist, swaying slightly with each step. At the far end of the counter, a folded map rested where she had left it, its edges darkened and worn from repeated use, a silent record of the route that had kept the convoy safe. A senior officer paused near the serving line, eyes narrowing slightly as they met hers. He tilted his head and spoke in a low voice, meant only for her. "Lieutenant?" he said. Elena looked at him, her expression calm, steady, and unreadable. She gave a single nod, neither confirming nor denying the title, and continued her work as though nothing had changed. The soldiers took their trays and moved on, laughter and quiet conversations threading through the hall, oblivious to the events that had transpired just hours earlier. The clatter of utensils and the soft scrape of boots across the floor filled the space, but beneath it all was a quiet sense of accomplishment, unspoken and uncelebrated. Elena moved to a small basin at the back, turning on the water to wash her hands. The gentle hiss of the stream and the soft clinking of plates in the background were the only sounds she allowed herself to acknowledge. She scrubbed away the remnants of the day, each motion deliberate, her mind both present and still aware of the decisions that had guided the convoy through danger. When the last tray was cleared and the soldiers had dispersed, she hung her apron neatly on its hook, smoothing the fabric and allowing the crease to settle. She stepped to the windows, where the horizon now lay empty and still, dust haze gone and the air calm in the cooling evening. Her eyes traced the distant line of the terrain she had traversed earlier, absorbing its quiet in the same way she always had, marking the memory without need for recognition. In that silence, the battlefield was hidden in plain sight, recorded not in accolades, but in the folds of a worn map and in the rhythm of her measured breaths. The smell of cooking lingered, gentle and domestic. Yet the weight of the day pressed lightly on her shoulders. Elena stood, composed and ready, knowing the next challenge would come without warning and that she would meet it just as she always had, quietly, capable, and unseen. The most capable often preferred the quiet path, stepping forward only when the moment truly demanded it. Leaving history to observe in its own time,